Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Argentinian Chainsaw Rescue. I'm Sherry Roughton, Southeast Development Lead for National Review Institute. NRI is the nonprofit journalistic think tank founded by William F. Buckley to amplify the mission of National Review magazine, to defend and advance the ordered liberty necessary to human flourishing and to a free, prosperous, and strong America. Our core values are a constitutional government, free enterprise, moral bedrocks, a strong defense, love of country, and defending Western civilization. Just a reminder that today's webinar will be recorded. Please feel free to use the chat feature for your questions once we begin the Q&A. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Marcos Falcone is currently the project manager of Argentina's Fundación Libertad, a free market think tank. He teaches political science at Universidad del Cima and was a Hayek Fellow at the Mont Pelerin Society. Falcone has also written for National Review's Capital Matters and writes a bi-monthly column for Argentina's edition of Forbes. He received his BA in political science in Argentina and later his MA in social sciences from the University of Chicago. Andrew Stuttaford is a contributing editor of National Review, for which he's been writing since the early 1990s. He took up full-time positions with National Review and National Review Institute in March 2020 and is now the editor of National Review Capital Matters, an initiative focused on financial and economic coverage. Prior to joining National Review and NRI, Andrew, who qualified as an attorney in the UK, worked in the international financial markets for nearly 4 decades, lastly serving as the CEO of the US subsidiary of a Nordic investment bank. Now I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Hello, hello everyone, and many thanks for turning up to hear about Mr. Millet. My sort of, should we say, I've never met the guy, but my acquaintance with him stems from having followed Argentine politics and economics for quite a few years, and normally as a horror story, and of a warning as to what could go wrong. And you would go down to, I would go down to friends down there, you go down to Buenos Aires, and you would see this evidence of tremendous past prosperity. The center of Buenos Aires looks like, in many ways, looks like a slightly rundown version of Paris at the beginning of the 20th century. And yet, something had gone wrong in the beginning in the sort of in the 20s and 30s, but really the wrongness started accelerating after Perón. Juan Perón became the president of the country, in fact, just before. And more or less, it's been down there all the way, with the odd interruption, attempts at reform, but ultimately they haven't really succeeded to break the spiral of descent. And then last year, I started reading about an Argentine economist called Javier Milei, who struck me as not correctly historically, but as being an ahistorical figure, but he reverts back to an earlier age of Argentine economic thinking. He described himself as variously as an anarcho-capitalist, but that sounds more frightening than it is. It's more a course of direction. But what he was saying is that if we're going to stop the sickness in the Argentinian economy, which Marcos knows much more than I about, we have to do something truly radical. And the problem ultimately is the nature of the Argentinian state and the extent to which it's, to use a melodramatic word, its tentacles have extended absolutely everywhere. It is spending far more than it can afford. And I thought, gosh, well, and he looked somewhat eccentric, so I was interested and kept an eye. He was running for the president. Oh, great, I thought. He won't get anywhere, but it's good that someone is saying these things. And then as the year progressed, to my amazement, he gained momentum parallel with inflation gaining momentum in the country. And by the end of the year, or just towards the elections were in November, what you saw was inflation heading towards hyperinflation, and you saw the Argentine people choose this outsider who'd been who was well known from sort of over-the-top performances in TV as an economist for the previous few years in Argentina, waving a chainsaw, saying this is what we're going to do to spending, doing little TikTok presentations, tearing off stickers of government departments that were going to be abolished or consolidated. And this extraordinary fellow won, which was a testament to the depth of the Argentinian crisis. And here he is. We're 9 months on. I saw an interview with him the other day. Times are tough, but there are signs of improvement. And he said, you know, I'm an economist and I've only been in charge 9 months, and I've got to put right what's been done over 100 years. So, Marcos, that's the very brief outsider introduction to Milei. And I think that, you know, what we really want to try to establish is how's he doing? But can you talk just first for a moment or two about where he came from?
Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew, for the invitation today to this webinar by the National Review Institute. I think yours was even though it was an outsider's, it was a very accurate description of what's happened here in Argentina and where we're coming from. I could add to that we are indeed coming from a country where corporatism, public spending have been the main characters of our story in the past decades. That was, in my opinion, the reason why we were experiencing monthly figures of inflation of about 13%, for example, last year before the election. And that certainly fueled Milei's rise, right? Because I don't think that people were much impressed by Milei's self-characterization as an anarcho-capitalist, but we're rather looking for someone who would take the country out of its misery and you know, revive it in a way. So where we're coming from is years of unbalanced budgets, and I know that in the U.S. That seems to, you know, no longer matter to anyone, just because the U.S. keeps printing itself out of every crisis. But in Argentina, you know, that matters, because if we run unbalanced budgets for too long, then, you know, we need to print a lot of money for which there is no demand. And so that causes inflation, particularly in a country where that is not trusted by capital markets. And so where, you know, borrowing is limited on the part of the state. And so, again, we were experiencing monthly figures that were eccentric last year. 2023 ended with an inflation rate of over 200%. That was just, you know, the end of years of high public spending, unbalanced budgets, fueled in turn by corporatism, because ever since Perón rose to power about 80 years ago, we've had a corporatist system with a lot of people benefiting from it, but with the majority of the people paying for the expenses that higher regulations cause, or you know, that the closure to the world causes in terms of how expensive products are, high labor costs also because of regulations. And so people were fed up, and people were looking for someone who would change the course of things. Back in 2015, people had elected President Macri back then with the expectation that he would, you know, expel the Peronists and finally change the course of Argentina. But that ended in a failure. And so this time, you know, back to 2023, there was no room for a sort of moderate alternative to Peronism. And so that's the context in which Milei's candidacy sort of explodes, right? Also because both his opponents thought that it was a good idea to keep him, you know, in the race, because the left thought that he was far too eccentric and radical to get elected, and the right thought that he could appeal to people who were disillusioned with the left, and so that he could take votes away from them. And what ended up happening was that Milei took votes from everyone, right? And so he finished first in the general election. That was a shock to the political system. Nobody expected that. And then when it came to a two-man race, it was him against the Minister of Economy from back then, which again, we need to remember, we were experiencing inflation figures of 13%. And so people were clearly not happy with his tenure, with what he was doing. And so it became clear to most people that it was either Milei or the failure that had driven Argentina into that disaster. And so that's how Milei wins, right? And so after that, well, you know, Milei as a president is a different person than Milei as a candidate, right? So it's not the same to campaign than to govern. And so the anarcho-capitalism of Milei is nowhere to be seen today, right? But it's like you were saying, Andrew, that seems to be more of a direction in any case, you know, of where things should go rather than what he is doing, right? What he is doing is he is balancing the budget, right? And that's a huge change in Argentina's political and economic system, because back in the Macri days, for example, Macri was telling people, you know, it's impossible to cut spending so as to balance the budget, right? And it took him 4 years to get to only a primary surplus, not a financial one. But Milei's government, in just 1 month, reached a balanced budget. That's unprecedented. It's been criticized because, you know, the effect of that is a recession, you know, a quick and sudden and deep recession. But Milei is very different from other presidents in that he told people what was going to happen. You know, when he rose to power, when he took office, he said the next few months are going to be horrible, awful, because we need to clean up this mess. And so by balancing the budget only 1 month after he took office, things seem to have changed, right? There's no longer runs against the peso, which we're used to seeing for many years. And so the peso is now appreciating way too much, according to some. And so that also sort of contradicts the idea that Milei wants to dollarize the economy, right? Because Milei was talking about dollarization. That seemed to be his main campaign promise. But now what we see is that Milei is actually strengthening the peso. And so the purchasing power of people is increasing in US dollars. Of course, there's still inflation, you know, domestic inflation. And so that's why things are getting more expensive in US dollars when measuring US dollars. But I believe if Milei can, you know, run the entire year without a deficit, that will signal a major change in Argentina's economic landscape, financial landscape, because the thing is, individuals, organizations, businesses are still trying to figure out to which degree they can believe in Milei's government. Because Milei can say, you know, my goal is a balanced budget, and they will have to kill me before I unbalance the budget. But then there's the question of whether he can actually do it, right? He did it for a month. He did it for 2 months. He's done it for about 10 months now. So there will come a point, I think, if the government persists with this course, that markets will eventually believe him, right? And that's probably the moment in which he will, for example, lift currency controls, which are still in place. And that will be the moment where investments, you know, start to come to Argentina. Milei is looking for them. Milei keeps, you know, meeting with Elon Musk and everyone who invites him to the US, you know, businesses, you know, people who want to invest in Argentina. He's encouraging people to come. But of course, people are not going to come if they think that Milei will not last for long, or that Milei's policies will not last for long. And so, you know, we're still trying to figure out whether he can, you know, stay on course for an appropriate period of time. And so one of the last indications that we've seen of confidence by the domestic market, for example, is that the number of US dollars that are deposited in Argentine banks has exploded following an amnesty of people who were supposed to pay taxes and didn't, and just took their money out of the financial system. The number of dollars that are deposited in Argentine banks is now, I think, double the number that was deposited just before the election last year. That's a huge change. It's the reversal of what we saw in 2019, where people took their money and ran, basically, and the number of deposits was cut by half in just 6 months. But that signals, in my opinion, that there's hope for Milei's administration, that at least the markets haven't lost it. Of course, there is public pressure. I don't want to go on for too long. I'm sorry if this is too long, but there's, of course, public pressure because of the spending cuts, which are hurting people who are, in retirement, because retirements depend on Argentine government. We have no private funds system. We used to have one. The government just confiscated it 15 years ago. So now everyone depends on the state. Spending cuts are also hurting public universities, and they're also hurting many offices and people who are fighting back, who try to fight back on the streets and also in Congress. And they're trying to force the government's hand and have the government spend more money, which is money that they're lacking, right? The government so far has resisted those pressures. It seems to stay on course regarding the balanced budget that it promised for this year and for years to come. But again, we'll have to see what happens, particularly next year, because Argentina has a system that is like the US, in that we have midterm elections just for Congress. That will be a huge test for Milei. I don't think it will change the composition of Congress too much in Milei's favor, but it will be a test of popularity of his government. That's where we will actually, get to see whether people are holding up or not. It seems like they are. Milei's approval ratings are between 40 and 50%, which, after the brutal kind of fiscal adjustment that he applied to the Argentine people, is remarkable, in my opinion, because he could well be in the 10s or 20s, but he's still holding up. I think, if you ask me, I think that the people who voted for Milei would still vote for Milei today, and the people who did not vote for Milei would oppose him today too. But I don't think that the political system has changed too much, and the political allegiances and preferences have changed too much. So the public is still waiting, markets are still waiting, but the government is delivering on its main promise, which is to balance the budget once and for all.
Marcus, just to go back to the question of support, and I look at those charts that they come out and they show, and as you rightly say, Milei's support is in the 40s and 50s, which is remarkable under the circumstances. And when I was down there for the conference which you were helping organize, which was a terrific event in June, I spent a few days staying on in the city to sort of try to talk to people. And a lot of people were saying, life is very, very hard. Their subway fares had gone up 3 times and things like that. But again, they were buying into this, there is no alternative, which, to anyone familiar with Mrs. Thatcher in the early 80s, that was very much the argument that she used. The question of his support, though, because I think one thing that is overlooked over here, and surprised me when I started looking into it, is Milei was so much of an outsider that he didn't really have a political party. There's a thing called, there's a party, or quasi-party, I'll get to that in a second, called MLA, which is Freedom Advances, roughly speaking. And it has, I think, 10% or so in the Congress, roughly speaking, and it's a bicameral system, just like the US. And then they're allied more or less with another center-right group, with the center-right grouping, but they're still not in a majority. I saw the other day that the LLA has now been founded into a proper sort of political party. There was some rally. The midterms are very important, like you said. Do you think he's going to be able to gain some degree of institutional support by meaning that his party becomes bigger federally and locally? Do you think that that will happen?
I'm not sure if it will, or maybe I don't think it will. I think Milei so far has proved that he is able to govern without Congress, basically. The magic number he needs is 1/3 of Congress to resist what's called the insistence of Congress in the case of a veto, right? So Milei has vetoed a couple of bills that Congress has passed on financing for public universities, for example, or for the people in retirement, with the argument that there's no money, that we can't afford that. Then Congress has insisted on those, but Congress has not been able to get 2/3 of the votes, which would have ratified the law under discussion. So as long as Milei can get to 1/3 of Congress, then he can resist congressional pressures basically to do anything. But the thing is, he's not. He only got like exactly 1/3 of Congress last time, and this is a sign of worry, right? Because if you lose just one representative or one senator, then he will be in serious trouble. Also because 1/3 is sort of the magic number that would save Milei in the event of impeachment, procedures, which I expect that at some point the opposition will want to bring on him for whatever reason, right? They will just come up with one. But I don't think that Milei's party is very well organized. It is true they have now turned into a proper national political party. Back in 2021, when he first ran for representative, and then in 2023 when he ran for president, it was more of a coalition, right? And this has also been reflected on Milei's government, which is a coalition government, because even though there's his party, then there's also ministers from other parties, right, including the presidential and the vice presidential candidates that he defeated, right, from PRO and from UCR, which are two political parties from which he is gathering support in Congress. But I don't see that Milei has an interest in building a party that will last, that will survive him. I think his project is a personal one. I think that what he wants to do is to stay in power himself. There is some talk of him trying to push his sister, to run too at some point for something. I don't think that's going to happen because even though she's his sister, she doesn't have the appeal that Milei has. Her only asset is being his sister. So I don't think that will work. But there's
someone told me, Marcos, that I said, tell me about the sister who's they're very close, and she's very much I think he calls her the chief or something like that, but I asked a couple of people at the conference in particular. I said, what does the sister actually do? And they said, and it wasn't a sort of Evita like description. They weren't saying, oh, well, she's a great populist in her own right. What they were saying is that she is an invaluable source of support for Milei, and an advisor and someone, it's a lonely job he's got, and that she is someone who he can turn to, basically. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, that's fair. I think she's a very good source of emotional support for Milei. Also, we need to take into account he's got no family rather than besides his sister and parents. So he's not married. He's got girlfriends, but he doesn't have any children. and his sister is a very good source of emotional and management support also, because whenever, people try to contact Milei from outside government for whatever reason, be that an interview, an invitation to speak at a conference or whatever, you go through his sister, right? So it's his sister who's sort of like, gating the agenda, right? Sort of controlling who he talks to and what he does. But to go back to the original question, I don't think that Milei is trying to build a party that will last. I think Milei is comfortable with the sort of administration that he runs, where he, gathers support from even Peronists, right? Because his chief of cabinet is a Peronist. Peronist from the old guard, in a way, because he's a Peronist
He
from the
admires
90s.
he admires Menem, doesn't he? As I recall.
Correct. Yeah, correct. And he used to work alongside Minister Cavallo, who was responsible for the liberalization of the 1990s. So he's a Peronist of the old guard. He's not a left-wing Peronist, but still he's a Peronist. So I think Milei is comfortable with that model, right? Just gathering support from the Peronists when he needs it, from Macri and his party when he needs it. Now the question is, of course, whether those people will be happy with being sort of satellites to Milei, right? There's some evidence that Macri is a bit angered because he expected to be given, he expected to get more power within the administration, and he hasn't gotten that. And there's speculation as to what will happen next year, because if Macri's party runs against Milei's party, that will split the vote. That will be bad for congressional outcomes. But talk of an alliance is still very early. So we don't really know whether that's going to happen, because we don't know if Milei actually wants to hand power to an outsider, right? Like Macri in this case. So we'll have to see.
Well, if I could ask, and I know we're soon going to get to Q&A, it's very interesting the point that you make about him not really wanting to build a party, that he wants to break the mold, if you like. One of the concerns, and this is, if people wanted, this is a long conversation which we do not have to have now. One of the concerns, but I think will be a concern for investors as well, and as you rightly say, he's doing a great deal to encourage people to invest in Argentina. He's passed laws which have made it much easier to do so. And it is also worth remembering that Argentina has some spectacular, potentially, or not just potentially, they have already oil and gas reserves, which may be quite an asset as the country goes forward. I mean, this is a country that ought to be rich. But one of the things that I heard at the conference that you and I went to, and there was a conversation about the dollar and the peso, obviously, because the peso is, as you rightly say, too strong. And you can tell that because there's an informal market. You just Google dollar blue or something like that, and you will see what the real exchange rate, if you like, more or less, of the peso is. But a couple of people said to me, I asked about dollarization, and I'm not convinced of it. I can be talked either way, but I think Argentina is not a small country, and it becomes much more difficult. And the number of people said to me is what we want to see is irrevocable change. And although we're not wild about the dollar, they said, like me, they said we can argue one way or the other, but we feel that we need some sort of institutional structure in Argentina that means that if Milei should no longer be in office, his reforms can somehow survive. And one way of doing this is by having the dollar. What do you say to that?
I actually think that's exactly the argument that people make. For the moment, I don't see the government going that route. And I think that's actually, that was Milei's argument, or Milei's advisors' argument, last year when people were discussing dollarization openly, on its merits. I think even, dollarization supporters were saying, yeah, we understand that perhaps the dollar is not exactly the best choice for Argentina, but it's better to have that than to have 200% inflation, right? And to keep having these inflationary crisis, hyperinflationary episodes over and over to decades, because the damage that causes is just tremendous, and it sort of and the benefits of dollarization offset its costs. I think that was the argument of Emilio Campo, who was Milei's main advisor on dollarization. He wrote a book on this. He was even named as the would-be president of the central bank in order to close it by Milei. But then, as the campaign progressed and he rose to power, then Ocampo stepped aside because he realized, that there wasn't going to be a dollarization, and so that was that. I don't see the government heading into dollarization today, because the peso keeps appreciating. One of the reasons why many people were skeptical of dollarization was that the Central Bank of Argentina didn't have enough reserves, enough dollars to actually dollarize without causing a hyperinflation, right? Without causing the exchange rate to explode.
Yeah.
And that has changed, but not dramatically. So the government has been buying dollars in the market. The government devalued the currency upon taking office. The official exchange rate went from something like 350 pesos to over 800. So there was a price increase of over 100% of the dollar, like overnight. That fostered, the liquidation of, as we call it here, of exports. Particularly soybean exports, who were waiting to get a better exchange rate. Well, they started selling their products, exchanging for their soybean proceeds for pesos at a more favorable exchange rate. The government has been able to pile up dollars, but there's just not enough to dollarize, right? We would still have to set an exchange rate that would be too high compared to today's, which is about 1200s at the black market, and the official rate is at about 1,000. So the gap is not that terrible today, right? Because it used to be over 100% too. The gap between the official and the unofficial exchange rate. But still, in order to dollarize, that number would have to go up significantly. That will cause an inflationary episode that sort of contradicts the entire goal of the government so far, which has been to tame inflation, right? Because it's not that the government is trying to balance the budget just because. They're trying to do that to avoid hyperinflation, right? To tame inflation once and for all. And so inflation has gone down. We reached a peak of 25% in December as the government liberalized some prices that were
That's a month, by the way. That's a month.
25% a month, right, in December, right. So, and we're now down to under 4%, and the government is still trying to, bring that number down to about 2%. Milei has said that when we get to 2.5%, he will lift currency controls. And he spoke of that as, in sort of deterministic terms, right? Like, we're getting there, and when we do get there, we'll lift currency controls and we'll continue with disinflation. That's what he's calling it. But all of that, does not need dollarization, and he doesn't speak of dollarization anymore. And so I don't think that he will, continue with this idea if he succeeds with the first, with this course of action. If he doesn't succeed, then he may try dollars, but the short-term consequences could be huge, and we've already had pretty bad consequences from the recession, right? That was sort of like induced by the government by balancing the budget overnight. So I'm not sure if the Milei government could survive, another shock like that.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and get started on some of the questions now. This is for you, Marcus. Has the government adopted climate change policies that will inhibit their ability to develop the oil and gas reserves?
No, it hasn't. The government is actually very skeptical of climate change policies for a country like Argentina, which is still developing. The government is also trying to incentivize oil and gas production. This is an interesting topic, actually, because oil and gas production has been sort of a long-standing policy in Argentina, at least for 15 years, which is, like a century for us. That has been meant, tax incentives have been maintained by either left-wing and right-wing governments. And so oil and gas production is increasing. It is exploding because of Vaca Muerta in the south. And it is suspected that that will continue with time. And I don't think that the government will impose climate change policies as restrictions because they don't like that agenda. Milei goes to the UN and criticizes, climate change policies on countries like Argentina. And it is very clear that the government doesn't like that. So I don't think they will, shoot themselves in the foot and implement that to stop oil and gas production.
There's a stereotype of Latin American culture being more collectivist. How are you, Milei, and his party laying the groundwork for a libertarian or classical liberal philosophy among the people?
So it's probably true that there's something in Latin American culture that makes it more collectivist rather than individualist. That may have to do with our Spanish heritage, perhaps the way that the Spanish Empire used to work, the way that it was very bureaucratic and close to the world and religious in a bad way. I think that's an issue for Milei, right? Because Milei is coming from somewhere else. Milei is an individualist. He describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist. So the kind of ideal society or ideal life that he has in mind is very different than the ideal society that Catholics, for example, or people, a typical Latin American person would have in their minds. So that's a challenge. That's why I don't think that Milei was chosen because of his anarcho-capitalist views, but just because he was an outsider that had a couple of very clear promises, among them dollarization, spoke against politicians, because there's one thing that people do perceive here in Argentina, and it is that something has gone wrong, terribly wrong, as Andrew was saying at the beginning when he was introducing me, and politicians are to blame. Then there's the question of which politicians, that gets more nuanced. But Milei was speaking very clearly against what he called the caste, right? The sort of all politicians grouped together as the culprits, right? So I think those were the reasons why Milei was elected. Also, he was eccentric. He had that sort of appeal for the masses because you would turn on the TV. He would be at a TV show, yelling at someone, and you just couldn't stop watching him, right? You then wonder, is this the right person to be president? Well, I don't know, but you couldn't stop watching him, right? So his personal appeal, his promise to dollarize, his stance against politicians, I think that's what got him elected. But I don't think it was the individualism that is at the root of his ideology. And I think that to govern a country like Argentina, which is just as collectivist as any other Latin American country, or perhaps even more so, is a challenge. And I think Milei will survive as long as he delivers economically, first in terms of inflation, then in terms of growth. If he does that, then the public will tolerate the fact that he is not a collectivist. But I don't think the public likes that. And you can see that, for example, just one more thing. yesterday there was this big demonstration in Buenos Aires by college students and also college politicians, because in Argentina we've got college politics, which is a very weird thing, if you ask me, where there's elections to elect the deans and the leaders of universities, and then there's political parties which sort of finance themselves with college money. And so there's a lot of stake when we're talking about financing public universities. And so those people were out on the streets yesterday. And according to the polls, most people don't like that the government is slashing their budget, because the idea of having public universities that are free to all, that everyone can access, that nobody has to pay for, of course, everyone pays for them in the form of taxes, but that nobody pays, tuition, that's something that people like. They like people coming even from other countries and studying for free in Argentina, because we've got that collectivist mind set up, if you will, that is very hard to fight. And so that's why many people are saying, Milei is picking the wrong enemy in this case, because people just love public universities because they represent this collectivist worldview that Argentines like. So that's why I'm saying Milei will survive and will succeed if he can deliver on his promises economically, but not because of his ideology.
Could I and Marcus, just to this is a supplement to the question answer. I think that there is also, just very quickly, that he as an intellectual himself, he is aware of the ideas of cultural hegemony, and what you have in Argentina and indeed a lot of Latin America is, as Marcus has just said, a presumption towards collectivism. And if you go there, I was shocked the first few times I went there to see sort of Che Guevara everywhere. He, I regret to say, was Argentine, and also governor of the Cuban Central Bank, which is a little known fact. But Guevara should be in the trash heap. But there he was. You could buy him in souvenir stores and all the rest of it. You go into a bookshop, and of course it's a little bit the same here. And every book was on politics or history that I could make out. Well, not every, but just about everyone was had a left-wing orientation. And I do think that he's got huge obstacles, but he is trying to change the conversation a bit. But how much that endures that's not why they vote. As you rightly say, that's not why they voted for him.
Okay. What are some of the most common critiques of Milei, and how would you respond to those?
Wait, say again. Some of the critics.
What are the best critiques of Milei? The
best critiques, like normatively for me, what are the best critiques of the government? I think. I think people like me, for example, I like Milei. I have no problem in saying that I voted for him all times. I want him to succeed. I think I expected more from the government in terms of taking down monopolies that are all over Argentina's political and economic system. And also, subsidies and protections that are still in place, and I don't think that the government will actually do something about them. So there's lots of legislative pieces by members of PRO, for example, which is Macri's party, who are trying to get rid of unnecessary bureaucracy when it comes to drivers. For example, car selling. When you buy and sell cars here, you have to pay a lot of money to the government, and there's some push from PRO to end that once and for all. And the government sort of, it seems like some members of the administration like that, but they don't go through with all that they should be doing if they really wanted to end, hidden tax action and the kind of thing that you get for example, with car selling. And so I think that many times the government has says things and then doesn't really follow through on its promises, right? This is also the case with, in general, deregulation. We've got a minister for deregulation now, Federico Sturzenegger, who comes from PRO, particularly from Macri's party. He's a great guy. I really like everything that he does because, he's tearing down regulation by regulation. Every day there's some piece of good news in terms of, just making it easier to import medicines, or, that there's going to be more options to flight, to fly from and to Argentina, or just any number of markets. But his ability to exert many changes is very limited because I don't think he has the full government support. For example, to tear down a protectionist regime in southern Argentina in a province called Tierra del Fuego. That's a province which is the southernmost state in the world. It is very cold and windy, inhospitable. There really is barely any reason why anybody would want to live there. And that province has developed basically over the past decades because it is protected by the government, which imposes very high tariffs on manufacturing products from all over the world, and gives subsidies, and actually lets businesses charge taxes in that province and actually keep the taxes for themselves, so that whatever is done in Tierra del Fuego then gets sold in Argentina, right? So it's a very typical protectionist model, only it is concentrated in a specific province, right, in southern Argentina. And those people have been living off of Argentine taxpayers, basically, for years and years and years. That costs people, the model has cost people, billions of dollars over years. Anyone who comes to Argentina notices that it is extremely expensive when it comes to electronics, for example, which is why people, for example, people in Mendoza, in Western Argentina, just cross the border and go to Chile to buy a computer, right? When people do that en masse, that something's not right. That can't be, right? That has to change, and it has to change immediately. I don't see that the government is willing to go that far, right? Lifting, the privileges, the subsidies, the privileges, the protections that those particular businessmen have in southern Argentina, because those people are important, for the government, because they're campaign contributors, right? Because, they're people who, crony capitalists, right? Were very skillful, in playing with politicians. And so until I see that something gets done on that, which is just outrageous when you take a look and study how the model works, it's just truly incredible. Until something gets done with that, I'm not sure how far the deregulation agenda really wants to go, right? I know that the minister wants to take it down. I'm sure of it. I just don't know how much, support he has from the government. So I think one of the best critiques of the government is that it's not going far enough on deregulation. And I would want to see more of that. And then there's also another critique that I think could be done, which is that even though the government has focused on slashing, public spending, it has also raised some taxes, right? And it has reimposed, for example, the income tax. The income tax had been repealed by Milei himself, right, by Congress in 2023 during the campaign. The Minister of Finance was trying to get sort of elected and become president. Upon the elimination of the income tax, Milei joined him in doing that so that he would be popular, but then he reinstated it this year, right? Even though he said he would cut his arm before raising or imposing a new tax, right? That means he has not delivered in that sense. He's also, when he rose to power, he also increased the tax on exports and imports, which is now, you know, back to its original level. And the government has sort of sold that news as, you know, positive news, even though it was Milei himself who had increased that figure. So I think, you know, that there's a couple of critiques, good critiques that can be done. You know, we need to go, in my opinion, farther with deregulation. We need to do more on that, and we should also start thinking about lowering taxes. You know, it's not just about lowering public spending, which is very important. It's a very important thing to do. We also need to lower taxes, and I don't see that happening yet.
Okay. Got time for one final question. Can you comment on Milei's popularity with younger voters, and what does that say about the future of free market ideas?
Well, I'm pretty optimistic on that because Milei's candidacy was supported by young people all across the board, really. You know, in all sorts of social settings and classes, if you will. I think Milei continues to have that support. Milei is sort of a cool figure for a lot of people, for a lot of, yeah, perhaps disenfranchised voters too, right? Among which are the youth. I think that young people have experienced many years of stagnation. We need to take into account that Argentina hasn't grown since about 2010, 2011. So if you're 18 years old, you've never seen your country grow. And all you've seen is inflation going up and up and finally skyrocketing. And all you've seen is people trying to leave the country, right? Trying to get some sort of European double citizenship, which is something which is very common here in Argentina, you know, a Spanish or an Italian passport to get out, right? So that you can actually plan your life somewhere where you can plan. So the young people, you know, young people have seen that for many years. And I think that's one of the reasons, well, that's the main reason why they've turned to Milei. So as long as he maintains hope, right? As long as he can deliver and tell these young people, you know, you don't have to leave the country to lead a beautiful life, you know, then I think he will continue to have support. I think I'm not sure the young, I'm not sure that the youth want free market economics. I just think they want a normal country to live in. Today, that leads to free market economics, right? I'm not sure what that would lead to tomorrow, but today that leads them to Milei. So I think, you know, if Milei succeeds, then he will keep that support, and hopefully that the youth will learn, and there will be the cornerstone in terms of generations, right? That will sustain economic reform for years to come.
Thank you, Marcus and Andrew. Do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up our webinar?
No, I mean, I think that the Milei story is a remarkable one. I think that part of it, again, you know, how has he been able to do what he's been able to do? It's by being you know, this is an old tradition in politics everywhere, really, by being an outsized personality. And I think that his charisma is a very important tool. So things that may sometimes seem a little bit strange to an audience here, for example, do resonate down there, particularly because of the background of the tough times that people have been going through for far too long. I see that someone has mentioned that someone has asked any lessons here for the US. Well, yes. is the answer. And the story about Argentina, and it may be our story, but we should reflect on this, is that it took an absolutely fundamental crisis to get fundamental reforms done. And it took a man willing to do them, or try to do them, but not as fully as Marcos has made out, for this to get going. The question is, we have a terrible budget situation here, and the debt, we can print dollars, and we have that advantage. People will still buy dollars, but it's not an infinite. It's not infinite. And when it goes, it might go quite suddenly, which we also need to be aware of. And the lesson of Millet, other than he's doing a lot of the right things, is that do we really want to wait until the last moment before trying to tackle the imbalances in our fiscal situation?
I agree wholeheartedly, and I hope the American people wake up to that situation before it's too late.
Well, thank you again, Marcus and Andrew, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. A reminder that our virtual Supreme Court preview with Pacific Legal Foundation and NRI fellow Dan McLaughlin is this afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are a limited number of tickets remaining for our annual William F. Buckley Jr. Prize Dinner in Chicago on October 24th, honoring Father Robert Sirico and Kim Dennis. In 2025 marks the Buckley Centennial, and the commemoration will begin with our Idea Summit on March 20 and 21 in Washington, D.C. And early bird registration is now open, and we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Sherry.